out of this today, mostly because, like I said last week, one of the things that I had, well, one thing I noticed is I talked a lot last week, and I really wanted to learn a little bit more about where you're going, getting you thinking about the tools that you might use, both in a qualitative, but also, as mentioned in the title of the course, in a quantitative sense. It's the best way in to get you familiar with the tools themselves. You might be using this for a piece of research, but even if you're not using it as a piece of research, the quantitative part of this, or the quantitative skills in research and evaluation, are transferable skills that you'll use in all sorts of other situations outside of research itself. And you've probably done something like this before using forms and other pieces. What I'll ask, I'm going to say it now, but I'll probably ask you again at the end of this, is my task for you this week before I forget. I don't know if you made it through the TOOS integration. Has anything changed? Has your email changed?
Just on Moodle.
Email changed, and yeah, I can't access the library, but I've.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. If you're having any of those problems, I mean, Course Director is the best place to go, but you can email me as well. Like, I'm trying to work my way through the changes as well. I couldn't get into Moodle for a good part of today, and then I thought it was because of the systems integration, but then I realized I was signed into 2 accounts, and that's why access was getting denied to me at some point. So that can happen. So just in case you're finding that, but most everybody found their way here, which is good. The 2 tools that I want you to have kind of more immediate access to, if you can, number 1 is Excel. So you should be able to get that fairly handily through the Office 365. So even if you're using at this rate, if you don't have a desktop version or one included on your computer, you should be able to get into Office 365 in your new TOOS ID or your student ID, the same student ID you normally use. And when you log in there, along with your student access, you should be able to download a copy of it onto your computer. I've discovered that works fine if you have a Windows computer. If you have a Mac, it's telling me, I have a Mac, it's telling me I can't download it. So I'm just going to check that out with IT and see. So I have a copy. It's not working for me at the moment. But I kind of want to start working with Excel, I think, next week, because I figure that's where we get a little bit more hands-on with both Excel and Microsoft Forms in terms of the early part of the primary research in quantitative approaches. The other thing that I'm putting a little bit more on the longer finger, but it's worth investigating, is checking out if you can access SPSS for next week's videos. So because I couldn't access Moodle yesterday, I'll put them up tomorrow morning, but I'll put up a video as to how to get to SPSS on the Moodle page and where the software download is, and I'm assuming that's still there, right? That's assuming that all works. I'll let you know if it doesn't work. But see if you get in there, and I just even want to check myself, is the license working? So you should be able to, at home, download the software and use the activation key from TOOS because the software will download for anybody, but it won't run unless you have the activation key, which is also in the download too, but you just need to type it in. But I'll do a short video, like 2-minute video on that, and I'll put that up tomorrow. Just see if you can do it. It's no worry if you can't have that ready for next week, because I'm just like kind of thinking ahead. But for a few of you, you might want to just have a look at it at first and see what's going on in and around it. Somebody did a hand raise, but then went, I think. Okay.
Matt,
Does that
sorry,
make sense? Sorry.
So I downloaded the SPSS. Where do you get the activation key?
It's actually a text file in the download. So if you look in the download, there's an activation key. Now, my experience with this, and this is part of why I was asking you, is the LIT, or the artist formerly known as LIT and now TOOS, the combined AIT LIT collective, is not the quickest at renewing the license on SPSS or NVivo. So sometimes you cross the threshold of a year or even the end of a kind of a semester, and the license needs renewal. So if that is happening for people and they can't renew at home, that's a signal that I just need to contact ITD and remind them. And that, I mean, they'll renew it. It just requires sometimes pushing somebody to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, good question. Thanks, Mary. Okay, and now because my PowerPoint isn't working, I need to use the online version, which is over here. I'm going to share my screen to keep me on target. Yeah, so can everybody see the Moodle page out of curiosity? Yeah.
Yeah.
You can get access to it now. Brilliant. Great.
Can I just ask a quick question there, Matt, just when I was on earlier on? Do you know the annotated bibliography? It says it's due on the 6th. Is that right?
Yeah, that's wrong.
Okay.
Yeah. My slides here are completely different to that, and I'll adjust it.
Oh, so no, it's on Moodle from...
No, you're right. Yeah, no, I think I originally, when I was planning it out, I thought the 6th, but then I looked at the timetable and the schedule and when we started, and I said, that's not working. So if we go by the slides that are here,
20th or something, is it?
It's the 20th of June, exactly.
Lovely, perfect, thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Can you see that screen? It says assignment dates on it.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah, so that's my that's what I have listed at this. So like I think I explained to you, the annotated bibliography is the 20th of June. That starts the process, the peer review process. As we're doing this, like I'll kind of note where I think there's some commonalities in what people do, and I'll put people together. Laura, I see your hand up with a question. You might be muted.
Hi, yeah, I was just wondering, can you hear me? I'm on the way home, so hopefully I have coverage. With the bibliography, does it have to be a peer-reviewed paper, or can I use a report which has all the findings that I want to look into?
Yeah, I have no problem with using a report that you find that like is really kind of relevant and interesting. So no, yeah, that's fine. I say peer review. I mean, peer review, you want like a bulk of what you're using to be really peer reviewed, but you may come across a couple of things that are really useful. So absolutely, that's fine. I have no problem with that. Particularly if they're quite relevant to what you're trying to do and what you're looking at. The reason you would do peer review really is to get a sense of the academic conversation that is happening in the area. So sometimes you'll find really good reports, and in particular when you're talking, within the area of health and well-being and social science, you'll see things that you think, okay, this is really relevant. A lot of that comes from, it comes from different organizations working in the field, so it's really useful. That's cool. I see Myra's hand up and then Neves. So Myra, go for it.
Hi, this is probably going to sound like a really silly question, but the annotated bibliography, is this kind of looking ahead to what we hope to look at for our thesis?
Absolutely, yes.
And I suppose that the reason I'm concerned is I actually don't know, or don't have any idea. I haven't really thought about, I suppose, what I'm going to look at. So I suppose it's just a case of go off and figure that out.
Yeah, just explore. And if you don't have a subject, that's okay as well. If you just think, if the annotated bibliography might just help you find a space you might have a general interest, and you may not go down that route. Like the annotated bibliography will not dictate what you do for your research. You may, after doing that bit of research, decide, you know what, this isn't what I was really interested in, and maybe it was something else. And that's fine. Like that, it just gives you, what I want you to do is jump in with both feet in the searching, the online searching, and working with largely peer-reviewed, but also reports, any research that's produced in a systematic manner. That's cool. Neve, did you have something?
Yeah, thanks. It's just one of the articles I'm reading there. The way that they're analyzing the data, I don't understand things like moderated regression analysis and things like that. Is that okay? Because I haven't a clue what they're talking about.
That's no problem at all.
Conclusion, yeah, that'll do.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. Like, you may not understand the techniques, but you'll get the language behind it, and that's the kind of idea. So even if you start to look at the article, like the thing about journal articles, right, is They are not something you, number one, they're not something you read, say, cover to cover. So there's something you skim, and there's a whole process of doing this, which is really interesting, which is you gather articles together, you skim through them, and you kind of decide what you think is relevant and interesting, and then, you know, move aside things that you think aren't. And a lot of that is done by reading the abstract, the introduction and conclusion, if I could say the words. If I wonder what the transcription does with that. If if you decide that you want to keep it, then you can explore a little further, and then you can dig into the methods. And you may not know exactly what they're talking about with the methods. So, like, the regression analysis is very interesting from a quantitative standpoint, because that's a central part of data analysis that a lot of people use to do things like test a hypothesis, for instance. And they compare two groups. And if I do a regression analysis on those two groups, I might be able to prove or disprove my hypothesis. It's really interesting. It's very heavily statistical, and we won't dive that far into the statistical methods, but I'll show you how you can do it. You know, but even if you don't understand it, it's okay to include it, because it might be an interesting method to kind of for future ideas.
Thanks for that.
No problem, Eve. That's good. Great questions, guys. Lorna, I see you're there as well.
Hi, it's just following on from the first brilliant question, because I was going to ask what's the difference between a scholarly, I don't know how to pronounce that, and a peer-reviewed. And again, if they're in a journal, but they only have an affiliation with the university, is that legit? Or do they have to have a review kind of comment in Google Scholar or wherever the source is?
Yeah, like the peer review thing throws people a lot, because like you almost start to second guess and question a whole lot. Like peer reviewed is not like, there's normally is, well, the red line of peer reviewed is that it contains an editorial board made up of scholars who are prominent publishers in the area. For the most part, like, it doesn't matter what about the author, because the author can be an affiliate or associated. That's probably more to do with the way universities and third level institutions now operate, and they operate on a lot of part-time contracts and all those wonderful things that keep people in precarious employment. But right, that issue aside, the state of the author is fine. It's the journal itself. Normally, if you're wondering, what you can do is look up the journal itself and look in the about comments in the journal, and they will clearly state they're peer reviewed. There are journals, and you're right to say this, that are produced that aren't necessarily peer reviewed, but are like conference proceedings and things like that, which look very academic, but may not have that same imprimatur on it. The reason peer reviewed is so held in such high esteem is there's a rigorous process of review where people look at it, they comment, and it's either rejected or kept and changed. And for the most part, it takes about anywhere between 6 months to 2 years to publish an article. And what's interesting about that, and this is my final comment, is that that's obviously quicker than the editing process for books. So a lot of the research you get is what's called cutting edge research, even though it's probably 6 months to 2 years old in this process. Only really highly held scientific articles get that treatment where they move them quickly because of the need for a breakthrough, for instance, like a significant one. So that's a great question.
No, and that's brilliant. And does that relate back to the other part of the CRAP methodology? If you're looking at something then over the last 10 years, is that recent enough in terms of, like, if it takes that long to be peer reviewed and to fully get cited somewhere else or cross-referenced, then 10 years is okay?
I think 10 years is definitely okay. Like, it really depends on the subject and how much publications and how much is going on in the subject area. Like, you have some sciences where things kind of happen so quickly that 10 years is a long time. You know, 10 years in astrophysics or somewhere is a long time. But in a social science, you don't visit these topics as often or as focused. And so therefore 10 years is entirely acceptable. And then some. Cool. I saw another hand. Aura, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. I was wondering if you are partial to local authors like Irish and British as opposed to other, you know, countries like American or maybe some Southern European, scholars, because I'm familiar with more, people from my country, of course, and I could also read in different languages, which might not be available to you.
That's
So
okay.
I was wondering, everything has to be in English, or so you can, read the article yourself, or can I read in whatever languages I can read into, and would that be okay?
So I would say you have an advantage in multiple languages in that you can look at other research that I don't have access to. And I would fully support you kind of pulling on other sources that are outside of the traditional. So while I would say I'm partial in that I know the Irish and British authors and a lot of things, and a lot of the American authors, I wouldn't have exposure to a lot of other authors. And so you may come across some really interesting piece of research. So like, I think the expansion of research on a global level is great because you get all sorts of, interesting inputs. So I'd be all on for you using anything that you can.
And if I were to do we quote when we do the review, do we quote them, or how does that work? Do I translate all the excerpts of?
So for the annotated bibliography part of things, you don't need to quote because it's a really short description. So you in your own words tell me what the article is about.
Okay.
Yeah. When we get further on and you're like paraphrasing or quoting what they're saying, that may get a little bit more complicated, but it's not impossible. Again, you could paraphrase what's being said. You could pull a quote directly out that's in another language and then add a translation. That's the way people normally do it.
Sorry, Matt, can I ask a question? Yeah, sorry, no, sorry, finished.
Yeah, no, it's okay, guys.
Yeah, what about, can I do research with, say, with published authors who specialize in a certain area? Or does it have to be journal articles?
That's an interesting question, and I would ask you to dig a little bit deeper into that. When you say it doesn't have to be journal articles, what sort of other publications are you thinking of?
I'm hoping to do something in coercive control in the workplace, which is kind of a new area, and I've looked at it, and it's mostly published authors rather than journal articles.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you'll find sometimes, and this is where like I said, it gets really interesting. And this is the best example I can think of this, is that you say, I told you that publication process for peer review can be long. So it can be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. That means the process can be quite slow. If you're really interested in cutting edge research, as in what's happening right now in a field, oftentimes you'll find conference papers where people float ideas. Now, the conference paper is not considered peer-reviewed because you're normally accepted on an abstract. So the way you get in a conference paper is you send 500 words about what you're going to talk about, and it's normally research that's happening or in progress. So if you're doing your PhD, you would send your conference paper idea and they would accept it, and you would give that paper and probably write it up, and then people could look at it and comment and come back. And that's before you publish it, officially publish it. So that would be not peer-reviewed and probably unpublished to a degree insofar as it's a conference paper, but you could use that as a basis to start discussion. But you need to remember to frame that in the current discussions that are going on. So for a lot of people, that would be about being familiar with the literature that's happened in the past 5 years, 5 to 10 years, if you want, and saying, okay, this is the field that I'm talking about in coercive control. This is what people have done in the past. But if we look at more recent things, this is, this is what we see, and that's fine. That means you're kind of digging into the field itself.
That's brilliant, Matt. Thanks.
Great, no, great questions, guys. And Aura, I think I saw your hand go down, which is cool. All right, okay, yeah, I'm gonna move through these things. I'm gonna try and move fairly quickly, guys. I see there's something in the chat. Will there be a sample? Thanks, Patrice. Will there be a sample on Moodle? Yes, I'll put a sample up there. I'm sometimes a little reticent with samples because people see the sample and think I have to copy it like that. Please feel that I don't have a set way of doing this. I will put a sample up, and I will put up the rubric that we use, to look at these things, so you know kind of what's expected. But that you can see how it's been done. I am open to a variety of ways. Like in the past, when I've done this, people have done almost like a table where they do the article and then a description and maybe even sometimes another column is like an evaluation of the article. So you could do it like that. Or you could just write it as a narrative format, like almost like an essay, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm open to all those things. The idea of it really for me is as an exercise, it gets you researching and writing. It gets you accustomed to using the bibliographic style and digging into the databases. But also the other thing that's really useful in doing this is it gives you foundations to write from. It gives you a couple of building blocks because now you're getting familiar with the writing in the area, and that's your first kind of attempt to digest this. And if you digest this now, then when you go to speak or write about it, you're actually incorporating that in your thinking. So it's the first level of the first level of drafting in that process. And I just find it a useful exercise in that. So I'll put a sample up, yes, but don't feel that the sample has to dictate how you write this. And if you're not sure, you can always ask me. And if you want to send me a quick sample, I won't grade it, right? But I will look at it and say, right track, wrong track. Thanks, guys. Okay, you can still see the assignment dates. I'm going to move beyond those assignment dates now and surprise myself with these two. These are 2 slides we looked at last week. I've just set them out because I thought the way they were like set up was harder to see. But the thing I wanted to concentrate on for today, when we think about quantitative research, we kind of touched on those differences between qualitative and quantitative research. A lot of people in the field of social sciences tend to be more familiar with qualitative research, and qualitative research is a really nice fit for social science because it incorporates a lot on experience and subjectiveness and interpretive approaches, whereas quantitative tends to be more about summarizing in a numerical format the ideas and concepts that are out there. And a lot of it is the third piece that's listed on that slide there, the process of measurement, which is central to quantitative research because the fundamental connection between empirical observation and mathematical expression of quantitative relationships. Oh my God, what does that mean? What that means is that you're essentially trying to do in quantitative research what you can't do in qualitative research is take a broad overview of things and summarize it mathematically so that it becomes not just about the concept, but the concept is something that you can see in a graph, a table, a chart that you can begin to compare. So you're not devoid of qualitative ideas. They're part of the way people answer, and they're part of how people answer questions, for instance, in a survey. Or even in an interview, you could be reviewing that quantitatively to a degree. But you need to be able to say assign numbers to those things.
Billy.
Oh yeah, I think that might be just somebody's microphone. That's no problem. And what I'll do, guys, actually is I might do a mute all in case we're getting some extra. But if you need to talk, you just mute yourself if you want at any point, or raise your hand, and I can do that. I'll turn you on. Well, the microphone will be on. The quantitative research piece that I have here is a couple of things to bear in mind. It involves information or data in the form of numbers, obviously. So when you're using quantitative, even if it's something descriptive that somebody is responding, in a quantitative piece of research, you're trying to find a way to summarize that as a numerical concept. And so oftentimes, did you guys use at any point, somebody tell me you might have to turn your microphone on to do this. Did you use Microsoft Forms for any of your previous projects? Neve, I see you going, yeah. Yeah. All right. Yeah. When you did that, how did you use it, for instance? What did you ask when you used Microsoft Forms?
Survey questions.
With it.
Yeah, survey questions, Killian, you said?
Yeah, it's survey questions.
Yeah. And were they open-ended questions or were they short answer questions?
A bit of both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like ratings, yeah, like 1 to 5 or satisfied to dissatisfied, that kind of.
Brilliant. Yeah, like did you come across the term a Likert scale?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. The Likert scale is this idea of how you rate things. Are you guys familiar with the and this is something that actually we'll do for next week that I'll include in it, but just some people may be more familiar with this or less familiar. The way we categorize data in between different types of data. This is a thing people do back in secondary school and then is lost and forgotten until you have to do data analysis as either discrete or continuous data. And discrete data, one way to think about discrete data is it can be categories. So like, for instance, did anybody ask in your survey a question about gender? What are your gender, like setting aside the political debate about political correctness, what do you normally see in gender options?
Male or female.
Male, female, yeah, male, female. Maybe you could include other now, in an EDI sense, right? Or other options can be listed within that, right? But traditionally, in the old kind of survey, you'd have two choices, right? It'd be a binary choice of male and female. Female. Now it's grown a bit, but each one of those choices or any of those choices could be assigned a number. So male could be 2, female could be 1. Other choices could move 3, 4, 5, and so on. So depending what people put, you can quantify that. You could take that concept, right? Which doesn't necessarily have a number. It's categorical, but it doesn't. You like male shouldn't be 1 or female 1 and 2. They don't rank each other. The Likert scale, which is really interesting that you mentioned, Laura. I think you said it, Laura. Yeah. Is one where you rank something, but the rank has no inherent value. So like that ranking is your personal preference, but you don't, it doesn't mean that that's always going to be that preference for everybody else. So there's no kind of core, like you give it an order, but the order is essentially yours. And that's that's a ranking value, say, that's included in that thinking. And that's part of discrete approaches to data. Continuous data is something that you measure, and examples that you often come across with continuous data are things like weight, because a weight can fluctuate, can actually be you don't necessarily give a determined number for that. It can be within the population. Age can be another one of those. So in a lot of health data, you'll see some of that, the uses of that. And those sorts of things are really useful later on when you look at all sorts of different types of analysis that are used. If you have just categorical data, you can still analyze it, but you're limited in the types of analysis you can use. If you have continuous data, and maybe continuous and categorical data, you can start to line up some really interesting outputs and analysis from that. I didn't mean to go into that right now, but that's a warning for kind of next week, we'll start looking at those categories, because what's interesting about those categories is it will help dictate your primary research questions. So when you're doing primary research, when you're asking questions in surveys, what you want the survey to provide with you is really where you should start. So that will help you structure the right questions in a survey. And that's how you build a survey. It's almost like kind of backwards from what you need, but you don't necessarily know the answers. And I mean, that can be a survey that you do, because with research, remember, you can do something like test a hypothesis, but you could also do exploratory approaches where you build a hypothesis. So your questions may be more open and you're just trying to assess the general kind of state of a population. The key to all of this is obviously the third piece in here. Respondents don't necessarily give numbers as answers. Answers are analyzed as numbers. So you always be asking questions in your everyday qualitative language, but you need to be able to summarize that somehow. So if we fill out a survey, sometimes you'll be asked your age. You can put your age in directly, which is a continuous piece of data, or you might be asked an age category. If it's then that becomes categorical. Like you can say, well, you fit into the 25 to 35 category, and so on. So it's interesting to think about quantitatively when we're working with data. Essentially, what we're doing is trying to work with measurements, and a lot of this comes from, to go back to that what we talked about last week, the positivist approach, which is this idea of how you build research that is testable and scientific in its approach. And maybe that's why I have the next slide. And I'm just going to open it up to general discussion here in the group. Well, we won't even do breakout rooms just for time's sake. And the question is, what do we mean by the term social science? Because a lot of what's covered in your topic and the topic many are working on, it fits within this idea of social science. What is a social science? And I'm not looking for an official definition, although I have one, I'm sure. But what would you think makes a social science a science even?
It's a study of society.
Study of society, brilliant. Who said that? A couple of people. Neve, you said something there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, study of society. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, great. It's a study of society. Is it a scientific study of society? And Neve, you don't have to answer that yourself, necessarily having answered one.
It would be, yeah. It's a branch of the sciences, isn't it?
It is considered. You're right, John. Yeah, it's considered a branch of the sciences. Interestingly, it's not like would it be an experimental science?
Possibly, because to me, it's the study of people.
You can consider in some circumstances, like there's some classic famous pieces. Actually, I have an interesting article which I'll leave up and share with you, of the most used classic social science studies in all of history. I pulled it off of the London School of Economics recently. It was an article published where they listed the top 10s in different categories. And it's really interesting to see some of those things, because they're different pieces of social research. And some of them are psychological or social psychological research where they conducted experiments. And there's some classic famous experiments. But a lot of those, even though they may have used some quantitative analysis, involve some qualitative observation in that. Mary, you started to say something there, did you?
Yeah, I was going to say I don't think so. But
why do you not think so?
Well, that's coming from a very kind of blinkered view. I suppose I've had very little exposure to social sciences side, so I would never have thought of it as black and white, maybe as other sciences.
Yeah, well, as in comparison to other sciences, and Killian, I see your hand up, so I'm going to go to you in a second. In comparison to other sciences, one of the things that you can do in many other sciences, now this is a very broad stroke, so it's not entirely like as simple as this, but one of the things you can do is identify and think of secondary school science. One of the things we were taught were independent and dependent variables, right? So you can do an experiment and you can identify and isolate different variables, and thereby you can try and prove and disprove something. And that in a social situation, in a society, there's no room to do that. Number one, there's ethical issues about experimenting on or with people unless they have consent and they know what's going on. There are many other variables when you're working even psychologically with people. And I see loads of hands going up, so maybe we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4 out through them. Killian, go first.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, for social science, I think it's like, I remember doing economics in college before, so I think it's a range of different subjects like psychology, geography, I'd imagine, under the social science bracket.
Yeah.
And again, I know did you talk about human behavior and kind of understanding that as well throughout social science? I think it's a wide range. There's a lot you can categorize under social science. I think that's what I kind of figure when I see social science.
Yeah, and it's quite broad. So I mean, that's one of the difficulties. We're working under a very broad church. So there are some things like economics that works, like again focuses like largely and uses a lot of the scientific methods, and when it doesn't, because it naturally is akin to working with quantitative amounts, and you see a lot of that. That's brilliant. Killian, I might hang on and see what Lorna and Michelle and Laura want to say. Yeah.
I was just going to say, in terms of credibility, if it's seen as a science and it is then used to develop policies to help that society and how people live, then I suppose putting that social science gives it more strength. Is the whole twin studies thing from years ago when I studied psychology, a lot of it was the whole nature nurture, and that was very much tested in terms of like how people lived and adoption studies versus people who lived at home.
Yeah.
would be, again, I suppose, the ethical thing, but do they even do that anymore? I don't know.
No, yeah. They try and avoid, like, well, you'd hope they don't do that anymore. I don't know, like, given who knows what goes on, right? But like largely in the scientific community, they wouldn't do anything like that ever again, no. But that's a really interesting, it's an interesting point about how those studies even came about and were reviewed, and it's given, and the thing that you said, it gives it a certain credibility when you start to call it that. So when you talk about this, it influences policy because it's done in a way that's systematic. So you may not be able to do an exactly positivist approach, but you take a systematic approach to the data in your review and analysis. And that's where a lot of peer review comes into this, because one of the things about having peer review is that the people who normally do this look at it and say, oh, you did this method wrong, or you did this approach wrong, or you're not looking at it this way, because it's not as black and white as saying, yes, it's definitely, a good piece of research and that's a bad. It's kind of more difficult to be able to tell those things. That's brilliant, Lorna. Thank you. Michelle, fire away.
So I was just going to add to the question about whether it was experimental or not. So I think that social science, a lot of it is looking at human behavior, and kind of the definition of an experiment is to look at how something behaves and what the causes are and the outcome of it. So I think by that I would say it's experimental, definitely.
Yeah, and you can have experimental research even for social aspects. Like one of the challenges for large-scale social research is to do that with is the Pepsi Challenge, a social science study. Brilliant. Who wants to try and answer that? That's a great general question. Is the Pepsi Challenge a social science study?
I don't know what that is.
No, don't do this to me, Laura. Lorna, sorry. The Pepsi Challenge, I guess I'm putting this, it was probably from the 80s. Maybe they did it into the 90s, where they blindfolded people and made them taste Coke and Pepsi and tell which one they picked, which wasn't so much a social science as much as a great piece of marketing. But you get interesting results, and interesting with that is that, like, that was just kind of like a descriptive study of in a marketing study of how people respond to a product. So you'll see that in marketing as well, which again ties into business itself. I jumped from one there. Who was just what we were just talking about just a second ago.
But no, that was kind of all I had to say on it.
No,
it's behavioral.
Yeah. No, like, and I guess one of the things is measurement, and in particular when you start to talk about behavior, psychology, social, in group and out group behavior in different groups and how they react to things, and other things that you become. What you get are layers and layers of variables to kind of begin to try and account for. And you can still try and do that. That's what quantitative research is about. But it's saying it's identifying what's the most important variable you're going to measure, and how are you going to measure that. And what that starts to distill down to are, for instance, is what sort of questions are you going to be asking a large group of people that they can answer, that you can quantify as data. So that's the sort of thing you should be thinking about. Brilliant. Aura, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about I don't know. Somebody mentioned that it's not like an exact science, and it's not. That's social sciences are non-exact sciences, but you can still have experiments. And the one that comes to mind was that when where they told something beforehand. You know how you have the group that you don't. Let's say you don't mess with their heads, and and they react based on what they have, and the ones that are told something, and the ones that are told something else, and depending on what they were told about the people they were looking at, they might feel pity towards them, or they might feel like torturing them, and they were like, depending on the story, they were told they react completely different, and that was one of the social science experiments that pretty much proved that each of us can become a torturer if we were told the right story, which was kind of scary.
Yeah.
And another large scale.
Yeah.
Another large scale human experiment, social science experiment was the COVID pandemic, when they were pretty much had all those rules that were never in place for anything, and they kind of could see how far they could push the the restrictions on us without us trying to be at each other's throats or trying to overturn whoever was there.
Very
So
interesting.
that was
Yeah.
like a huge experiment, like a
Yeah,
global one,
yeah.
and it would be interesting to look back on it and to revisit that, like when it's more time passes, so we have a bit of more distance, towards that, and that would be a very
Absolutely, Aura.
interesting piece
Yeah.
of research.
And there's some interesting data already collected and gathered from that, because we saw a lot of that. And Geraldine, brilliant, you've mentioned it. All right, points there. Is everybody here familiar with the Stanford prison experiment? And Aura, what you mentioned sounded very like that. In the it's a classic one. A lot of times it's used to illustrate ethical problems, and it was done lots of university research is done within the university, and they said, oh, we've got a pool of students. We'll just use students essentially, and we'll make some students the jailers and some students the prisoners, and we'll see what happens with their behavior as we go on. Now, this is a huge ethical problem, because a lot of the students themselves that were participating in this didn't know what it was about. But one of the things that they found when they did the experiment was that as the days went on, the guards of the prison became more and more sadistic and actually started to torture the prisoners themselves. They had to stop the experiment. That you wouldn't do that today, a little bit like the earlier question, because of ethics. So it's often highlighted as never do this, but it stands in there as one of those interesting experiments. There's another one called the Ash experiment. I think I'll see if I can link a video to that where they do this thing. It's kind of entertaining to watch, where they watch a person's reaction in a group. And in the experiment, the whole group is in on the experiment except for one person. So they bring them into a room and they show them a series of pictures of lines, and the person has to point out the shortest line, except for the fact that the other people who are in the room with them, they start off and they pick out the shortest line, and then they show another slide, and then the whole group picks the second shortest line and says, oh, that's the shortest. And they watch that the one person who's not in on the experiment, their reaction to see. And eventually what happens in the Ash experiment is the person who's in the group, who, even though they see it's the shortest line, they agree with the group, that you fall in line with the group. They tend to anyway. But again, that's not an experiment you do anymore, because you need to give people awareness of the situation they're coming into. Yeah, Michelle. Oh, Katrina, I'm sorry. Katrina first, and then Michelle. Katrina, you've probably been waiting too long, have you? Or have I said it? We may have lost you, Katrina, or I said it in my long speech, or somebody else said it. You can come back if you want to say it. Michelle, go ahead, fire away.
Yeah, just the example you gave there about the person agreeing with everyone else on the shortest line. You see a lot now on social media with social experiments and how people will mimic the group. Like there's one I saw probably a couple of years ago about the person in the waiting room, where every time a bell rings, everyone stands up, and then eventually they're all standing up, and by the end, all the original people have left, and it's all new people who are all just standing up, all following each other.
That absolutely. Actually, what's interesting about that, because you see a lot of this on social media, like and experiments. What makes that not a scientific experiment?
Yeah.
And I'm not you, Michelle. You don't have to answer that. I'm asking that to the group. And Katrina couldn't talk; her mic isn't working. But she was going to mention the Stanford experiment again. They did a movie about it recently. I never saw the movie. I just remember, like, not too long ago talking about it, because it always comes up, the Stanford experiment, because it was such an extreme situation. And it'll probably come up again when we talk about ethics, because it's one of those things in ethics. One of the reasons one of the things you kind of have to highlight in ethics is when you work with human participants. Oh, it's a good portrayal. Hard to watch. Yeah. Katrina, I'd say the whole thing was so bizarre. Yeah. So what makes those social media moments not scientific experiments?
Well, there's no research and to back it up, and it's a lot of everyone will have a different observation of it.
Absolutely, yeah. There's nothing, and again, maybe this is what makes the social science a science, is it's not systematic in its approach, and it doesn't use kind of the tools of analysis that are part of science. It doesn't then appear in the scientific journals, right? It's something somebody does. It's fun to see because it does play with a concept. So you probably could take, I mean, this is where we have this expanding world. You could take a concept like that and say, I wonder, could I develop something as a piece of solid or scientific research to investigate that? Because that's something we see happening in the social sphere, but it's not something that's recorded. Or so if I want to find out the actual research behind that, I can take those ideas around the experiment, whatever the experiment might be, if it's the, who follows along, and start to look at the current research that's there in, again, the peer-reviewed journals to see, is there a conversation about the way people respond to group behavior. So it's about finding then the right search terms to look for. So think about what's happening there and what you might be searching for in the scientific articles. And the places you would probably look for that are on things like a library database, and in the library database itself, not just in the broad one, but also subject specific ones. So there's like a social science, a SOC index, social science index is one of them. I'll show you some of those that you might find useful, because they're good databases to search for within specific subject areas that relate to health and well-being in particular. And then another broad place, but it actually, is quite good as a general guide, is Google Scholar. Again, it's not comprehensive, but it can lead you in the right direction.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question, Matthew?
You can, Killian, yeah.
Just if you're looking for peer-reviewed papers, I know you can filter it on the library, but if you're looking, like I use a website called Connected Papers, and it just brings up a graph of different topics of whatever I'm searching for. But how do you know if it's peer-reviewed? Like, is there some sort of guide? Is there some sort of something on the paper that'll tell you?
So, are you talking about papers are they part of a journal? It's
maybe.
Yeah. So the way I would suggest you do that is go to the journal itself. American Journal of Sociology, for instance, and go to the webpage for the journal. Normally in the webpage for the journal, you'd have something about the journal itself, and it would normally state within that whether or not it was a peer-reviewed journal. It may require a little bit of digging sometimes to see it,
probably,
but
probably best to just filter it on the TUS library rather than trying to go down the rabbit hole trying to search for it, really, isn't it? I mean, the thing is not to get too caught up in it. Normally what happens after a while is you begin to notice or know the ones that are fairly popular in the subject area. And you will see them over and over again. Another good rule of thumb is when you're looking at articles, if you look at the bibliography and like if you find one good article and look at the bibliography in that article, you will see a link to other things. But oftentimes, not just the articles themselves, but who's publishing those articles. What are the journals where you see a lot of repeats in that topic? So if you're investigating that topic, start to take note of where you see that topic discussed a lot, because that means that'd be an interesting journal to look at. A real great skill that we don't do anymore, and part of it is because of computers and because of search engines, is we find it easier to search for a topic and it brings us right there. And what we miss in that process is what you used to do in libraries a long time ago is you'd go to the journal section, you'd find that journal that you were interested in, and you'd leaf through it. And when you did that, you didn't just go directly to the article that was most relevant to you. You would look at other articles. And sometimes what's useful in that is, even though it's not about your subject, the methods or the ideas that are used or the approach or even the structure can be really useful and can set you up. Like one of my favorite classic articles of all times, it's a politics article by a guy called Graham Allison. And he didn't do anything unique in his analysis. It was actually very qualitative analysis and approach. But what he did was, in his approach to looking at policy, he looked at the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, and he said, you can explain this from three viewpoints. One, a geopolitical viewpoint of the US and the Soviet Union.
to the civil service and the interaction of the civil service of the US and the Soviet Union and how they respond to each other in communication, or 3, the way Kennedy and Khrushchev as elite leaders worked or didn't work together. And that set up a whole, like a whole piece of a whole structure of policy analysis that people still use today when they discuss things. But that method, isn't directly suited to maybe a particular topic, but you might find a structure that you can use, and you can cite that as your approach or the structure that you would use, even though it's not like subject relevant. So browsing is really useful when you start to identify the journals. There are other things that might, and I'm just I'm killing this a little bit, but just to be aware of this, a meta approach to this is that, like, different journals compete with each other. So the journal, one of the things that makes peer-reviewed journals so held in such high esteem is that they are meant to be removed from the market. They're not a tabloid publication. They're not a newspaper. They're not competing with other journals for people to buy them. So they're less likely to produce sensationalist research to sell, right? The idea is that you get a subscription as a university or higher education, which is paid for through either the state or, you're a private university and you can afford it, but you sign up, and in that subscription, then you support the structure of it. Having said all that, there are instances where journals get it wrong. So there's some interesting things, like there's a website called Retraction Watch, where they look at journal articles that have been pulled because the peer review wasn't as rigorous. But also journals do, so the idea that they're free from the market isn't necessarily as true as we believe it is. They do compete with each other. There's a thing called the ISI Web of Knowledge that ranks journals. Now, I wouldn't worry about that as an undergraduate, or even a postgraduate, even as a PhD student largely, but it's something that you may become aware of, is that journals are ranked, and the higher ranking journals are harder to get into, which means either that it's more of a kind of a closed network that you're working with in terms of the subject area, or it's just that the research is really kind of high-end research and involves, either consortium approaches with groups of universities or like really high-level scholars. Now, having said that, most peer-reviewed journals are all held in very high esteem. Yeah. Oh, Geraldine, brilliant. Thank you. You've got there. What is it? It's an article from the Guardian, is it?
It's just recent, about the load of leading scientists that went on a kind of a protest over the unethical practices. So it's just an article about that.
Ah, brilliant. No, that's great. That's great, Geraldine. Yeah. No, it's really interesting. It's a little bit of a rabbit hole, so that I would warn you. Once you're concentrating on your research, you're fine. It's very unlikely you'll find something. I mean, the classic ones that you do come across, for instance, the Lancet did a study once on autism that is often autism and vaccines, that's often used in an anti-vax discussion, because in it they used a very small sample, but in it they tried to see they claimed that there was a correlation between, like, say, autism and vaccines, and it was published by the Lancet, and the Lancet obviously has retracted that since that happened a long time ago. But it's seen as the classic example of that, because it still comes up in, you'll see it in the Fox News debates or things, and people say, oh, there's scientific research to prove this. And it wasn't really scientific research, it was poorly constructed scientific research. But yeah, that's the thing. I mean, social science is like, going back to what John said, it is a science, Killian, you're right, it covers all sorts of areas. It does use a systematic approach. It's not as black and white as you would hope it to be. So there are, the reason it can be questioned is because it involves kind of so many factors and so many variables. In a quantitative sense, the thing that you're trying to do is measure variables, and you're also trying to come up with a systematic and reliable way to verify your measurements. And that's really hard, because you need to come up with questions that get to the core of concepts. So when we do social research, a lot of things we ask about, and even some of the earliest social research, do you ever, I'll leave him out of this now for now. The early sociological research, Durkheim, did you ever come across him? 19th century research, trying to be scientific like a physicist or a chemist, but he thought we'll apply this to society and we'll look at suicide. So suicide rates, and his idea was to compare suicide rates between the two major religious groups in England at the time, which were Protestants and Catholics. He worked on the assumption that the Protestants would have low suicide rates and the Catholics would have high suicide rates because of wealth differences, that the Catholics were poor, and in the 19th century 19th century England at the time. And when he did actually collect the data, what did he find? Opposite. Yeah, Lorna. Yeah, exactly. The Protestant population, which was wealthier, had a higher suicide rate than the Catholic population. And I mean, that's a classic of social research that, I mean, again, if you look now, has all sorts of problems with it, and even the way he interpreted it. But from that, he based his idea was, well, the Catholic actually had a better network and they were more supportive of each other than the Protestants, who were wealthy and more distant from each other. Now, there's a lot of conclusions.
More afraid.
What's that?
More afraid of the afterworld as a Catholic.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so there are lots of things that weren't taken, even in the analysis there were lots of things that weren't taken into account of the analysis. So there are lots of variables there that maybe you could have identified, or he could have identified, that that he didn't do at the time. And now that we look back, we can kind of say, oh, he's definitely missing that, or, he didn't consider this. And if we were to do it again now, and people do still do it now, and still look at these things, they can't come up with one direct answer. They find it very complicated. Does that stop us from doing it? No, because it means we'd still explore with surveys or observations, or try and see through CSO data, like collected data, to see if we can identify those sorts of things. Okay, I've actually talked all the way through, and it's nearly 7:30, so I'm going to stop it there. What I'm going to say is, next week, what we're going to start with is, I want you to think about your research idea. So you're continue researching, continue looking things up. And when you're looking at your research idea, ask yourself, in the research you'd like to do, this isn't, even if you're not doing a master's, but if you just want to look into a subject area, is there a way you could do it as a piece of quantitative research? And that quantitative research can be one of two major paths. One is called descriptive research, and that is where you describe a population. So you go out and ask the population a series of questions based on your, what you want to find out. Or is it something that's called inferential research, where you try and infer or kind of test a hypothesis or test a question out there, or compare two groups and see the difference between them? And can you infer from a smaller sample or population to the larger population? Which, there's another word for that you'll come across in the research, which is called generalizability. It's a really big part of scientific research, which finds its way into social quantitative research, which is, if you look at the right size sample for a population, can you generalize from, if that sample is a random sample, for instance, can you generalize from that sample to the rest of the population, be it at a national, international or global level? Think about that in relation to when you're looking and reading. So continue to gather those articles and just start working. I'll put up a sample for the annotated bibliography. I'll have it up tomorrow, I'd say. And look, if you have any questions in the meantime, just email me. Does that sound okay with you guys?
Yeah,
brilliant.
Good.
Brilliant. Thank you all. A really interesting discussion.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Matthew.